All right, post 10.
Woo. Hi. Hi.
Okay, so
who's A and B?
I can start with
Let's jump in.
I was talking a lot about what we've already learned a lot in SPED is BICS and CALPS and how it takes 2 years to have conversational fluency, and CALPS's takes around 4 to 9 years to acquire language proficiency in the academic sector. And it was kind of interesting because we also learned about, they gave like this quadrant thing, which my part was just focusing on the, maybe you guys can elaborate on that later, with the content embedded and the context reduced. But it was kind of interesting because it's so much easier, if you were a student, ELL student, or an emergent bilingual in a class and you were watching your teacher speak and they had motions and gestures and stuff, it's so much easier to understand, so that's context embedded. Or like when you're you're outside in the rain talking about the rain.
Oh,
like,
yeah, I cover
that makes sense.
That's
It's easier to follow.
experiencing what you're talking
Yeah,
about.
like even if you miss some of the words or the verb tense, you can be like, well, I heard rain and I heard this, and so then you can have the conversation. But context reduced is when it's more lecture style and there's nothing but just voice. And if you tone out for a second or don't pick up on all words, you're not going to understand.
Yeah, then you're going to get totally lost.
Yeah. Does any of yours like
Mine
that?
actually goes into this a lot. Okay, I talked a lot about conversational fluency and the academic language, and I thought it was interesting that in this they prefer to use that like quadrant thing instead of the BICS and CALP. From the conversational fluency, it talked a lot about how you pick up the message from the tone of voice, facial expressions, gestures, and so forth. So, like you said, the rain, like conversation about like rain in the rain. So even if it isn't entirely understandable, you can use what's going around, like what's going on around you to contribute to the conversation. And then, so on that chart, it would be cognitively undemanding and way over this way. I can't remember what that side is. The left. So like the lower of us. Okay. So other examples might be like talking about vegetables or something in the store. Like you can go and like, hey, I'm talking about carrots. Look, here's carrots. Or something, which is just kind of what I got out of that. And then for academic language, like when like standardized testing, so questions are often not related to each other. So you can't look to other sections for like clues about what this question, like what the answer might be. So they have to rely solely on their knowledge of the language. So it's cognitively demanding. And on the other side, the right side.
Yeah, so I guess they're moving away from BICS and CALPS and saying it's
Yeah.
so much easier
Which
to
blew
do
my mind,
context
Because
embedded
this
than...
class has such an emphasis on BICS and CALP. Or like that was like everybody was trying to memorize that and how that was so important. And then I read this and I was like, what?
So those terms would sort of replace the idea
I think it's just
of,
expanding it. It's like
Yeah.
deepening what that means.
not
It's just
a-
like...
or
it's
like,
just-
yeah,
it's not
labeling
just
it by
so
why
bad.
it's easier for
Yeah,
them.
it's not socially
Okay.
and academic, like that's really broad terms. I think it's saying it's more like understanding context, or can you read something and totally understand what, or hear something.
Yeah, and like having direct experience with.
That's why it's important in our emergent bilingual classrooms to help add that context and slowly remove it.
Mine was how can a teacher support writing in academic language, and they can support it by following a process. And I think it's pretty self-explanatory. But like, you plan lesson objectives, then assess current language, then teach along the continuum, and then that approach can help move ELLs from conversational fluency to academic language proficiency. And I feel like that is a very standard way of supporting writing, and also just supporting lots of different knowledge. Just being able to be like, this is what I want to set, this is what I aim to achieve, this is what you know, let's continue that knowledge and use scaffolding and the zone of proximal development, and then be able to be fluent in both languages, or both conversationally, socially, mix, and calp. So,
And Maddie, did you want to talk more about the bricks?
Oh yeah, we can go down to that. Oh.
I'm excited to hear about this.
Okay, so that was in the article Zweer's chapter 2. So he just kind of broke down the
Spears.
Zweer.
That person.
He broke down the idea of academic language into two kind of different kinds of terms. Bricks would be the technical terms of a certain discipline, so like, say, biology, maybe photosynthesis would be like a brick term. But then he also talks about, the part that I found interesting that he talked about was these mortar terms, which are more really conceptual understandings of how different concepts relate to each other. So like even the word like therefore, how do you explain that word? Like
I talked about these things, yes.
Yeah, and I don't know, I'm definitely verging off here, but how, like in thinking how you would teach those words, what I thought about the way that I probably learned those words and learned to use those words was through reading, more than anything.
Just putting in context.
So I don't know, I thought none of the materials we read this week really talked about the importance of reading and kind of learning to write.
But I think it
seems like a big deal to me. I don't know.
It's one with the other.
Right? Like,
Yeah. You learn how to write because you see the words written there. You learn how to write sentences because you see sentences.
And you speak because you're reading.
Because you're reading and because you're writing. You're around all that language. I think we all talked about, like, I'm not sure if it was this week or I think it was last week, for like different types of language that we use growing up, or like we talked about like books on tape, or like
or
just like books, or being able to access that knowledge, or access the language. I think that's really important.
So
Blanked on last week.
That's okay. Talk about like different forms of language and how and how it affected the language that you use today.
I think that's totally agree. Like, I'm able to say complex words, I think, enunciate them correctly because I heard them first and then read them and then connected the two. And I think that, like, just saying a word, especially because I'm, like, a really visual learner personally, like, when you hear a word, I guess this kind of goes on to talk about, how we learned language, but I have to see it. Like, someone can say a word 5 times.
No, in the same way.
And I'll lose it in just a minute if I don't see the word. Can't visualize it.
So maybe a way to support kind of the development of these mortar terms, or even bricks too, for an ELL that would be really individualized is if you pick a nonfiction book for them in like an area that interests them and like they want, because they're going to be required to read books anyway, just like have a book that they're reading in class and stuff for free reading times, and then I don't know. So if you kind of make conscious choices about that.
So in my second, so my first D was just talking about like different ways teachers can support, but then my second one was talking about like the functions and features of academic language, and I kind of went to town. I got really excited about it, but
That's cool.
I forgot that I got excited about it, but now looking back at it.
You're sure you're excited.
Yes.
So the functions of academic language, like thinking about it, was really fascinating. Like the word circumference describes a really kind of complex thing. It's like the whole circle of it. Like it's just it.
Yeah.
That word describes a whole mathematical function, and it's just a word. So there's different functions to academic language. One is to describe complexity, and to be able to explain a complex concept as simplistically as possible. Another one is to describe higher order thinking. And so like in science, when like in high school when you're saying like analyze, predict, use hypothesis, like those are kind of complex ways of thinking, like predicting what's going to happen in like chemistry, or like analyzing what's happening, but using that word is also describing the same mental process that's happening. And so it's kind of like a trigger for that. And that's really interesting. And then to describe abstract thinking, and so in the book they said like the word point of view doesn't actually mean that you're thinking of where the person is physically standing on like a bluff. There, it's actually like their whole background and their perspective, and how it relates to what their subject they're talking about. And that's abstract and kind of complex too. Being able to be like have like empathy towards the author or towards the person that you're reading about, and their point of view. I think that was so interesting. Just being able to be like, the word view can be so confusing if you're trying to describe it to an ELL student. Like, so you, like what they're looking at, I don't know what they're looking at. I don't even know if this person's a real person. Like,
it's super important to know on the phones.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of them.
There are so many of them.
Just a view, I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting. And then different features.
That's a discrete distinction too.
Yeah. Different features, there are lots, but words like could, would, should, or perhaps, seldom, often, they're also called modifiers or hedges. And
you'll learn a ton about that in 430.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I didn't know about these things. They're super interesting.
432. She meant.
Oh, okay. I was
Yeah.
like,
Yeah. Or another thing to think about is the word metaphor. Like to us now, we can be like, oh yeah, metaphor. Like that stands in place of this. But it's like having a variable in English. Like it's like the value x, like in math, but in English. You know, it's like saying when you're doing a math problem, like this is going to represent this for now. Like I remember, and for me, like that was.
Oh yeah,
I was like when they started introducing letters. I was like,
no, I don't get it.
But
That's not allowed.
I was never really like that in English. Like I was never like metaphors. Okay, he's not like this is not what's actually happening. Like darkness does actually not mean death. Like I was never actually like that. But I can understand how that'd be so confusing. Just because if I struggled so much with math and like. That variable representing something else that actually was there, and same thing with like figurative language. So, yes.
Could tie that in with the first question that I had, which was about the threshold hypothesis, which I honestly don't think that I understand that well, but I do know that it has to do with the transference of knowledge between an emergent bilingual's first language and their second language. So if they're familiar with concepts like that in their first language, with those like kind of academic, like abstract ways of thinking, then it's going to be a lot easier for them to develop that in English as well.
But we need to have access to that.
Exactly, and I don't really know how...
Like, even when... Okay, so, like, my friend from India, like, I say an idiom. Like, my mom loves idioms, so I just use them all. We use them all the time in our house, and I used one. He's like, that makes... What did you just say? You know, because a lot of idioms are really weird. And so you couldn't be like, oh, you know, like in your country would like, you know, a cow bumps into a wall or something. Random.
The thing is, like in other languages, they have those idioms too, and then you're like, what? Like, or they'll like laugh about something, and you're like, I don't. Like humor is so played into language
and
culture. I was just talking to this one girl who saw the improv team. What are they called? The Parents Society. And like I guess like last week, they're like the Canadian group came with our group, like Canadian. They did a joint show here at Western, but like I guess the Canadian humor was very different than the humor that like the Dead Parents are using. And like I have family that lives in Canada, and there are some jokes I'm like, but but it's really interesting that it's just 40 minutes.
And that's what's so interesting too, because like after watching that bilingual video on those kids that were in the dual language programs, it's like we will not have access to that humor until we're fully fluent in another language.
Yeah, like
it's
that
really interesting.
humor and language.
Do you think that you do develop that? Like you're able to catch on to what the different humorous things are? Like if you go.
I think if as soon as you're fluent, which takes Calp says, like
5 to 7
it takes a while.
Yeah, and I think it's also. Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm so sorry.
You can keep talking.
I was just playing on what you guys said. I had a friend Waleed from Algeria, and he was here last year studying abroad. And he went to see Dead Poets Society, and he came back, and he's just sitting there. He's like, "They're not funny." It's like, what? Like, I don't get it. They're not funny.
Yeah.
I was like, well, they are funny. Like these different things that they didn't know. They're not funny. I was like, okay, like. I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Because he didn't understand the cultural.
He didn't understand any of the cultural things. By the end of the year, he went to the same, like, a similar presentation, and he like thought different things were funny, and he'd gotten on to like what different humor.
It's interesting that we're really off topic now, but it's interesting that humor can be something that's so specific to a certain culture, a certain language, but also can be like a huge point of like unity and cross-cultural like stuff, you know, like it just.
Unless you're at the Pita Hub. Remember at the Pita Hub, they like made weird jokes, like they wanted to like create some humor between them because they thought it was universal, and they like did weird.
Oh yeah. And people are just like
crickets.
No.
Oh yeah.
The tribe, the Amazonian tribe, and
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was.
So let's do the Pita Hub.
That's true. That's really funny.
Good connection.
Yeah.
I think that for an ELL student, that'd be another big difficulty is with kids your age. There'd be a lot of
Think about that.
there'd be a lot of aspects of school or at recess. Kids would be talking about things and making jokes, and that they'd be so based in their culture and in their language, and you would probably think that it's weird. Why are they acting like that? It's not funny. Like that's what's wrong with these people.
Yeah.
Or they feel excluded.
Or they feel excluded. Or
Even with
maybe
music
there's
videos and stuff, you don't understand the music.
Yeah.
Like harder to like sing along and
Like,
all this little stuff.
like there's this one. There's a lot of Bollywood movies that are really great. I love Bollywood movies, but there's this one movie called Dabong, and it's about this police officer man who's like this really like he's kind of a jerk, but he like is really strong and is able to like solve all situations just by like I don't know putting his fist down and like concrete ripples and like the bad guy's like oh no and he has like all these dance sequences with this belt that like dances on its own and like I saw it with my friend in the movie theater and like all these people were dancing to it and like they were like because they'd seen it a couple times and they'd be really excited, but there were like parts of it I was just like
this is too weird for me.
This is really weird, and I don't find this funny. I was just like offended by some of the things he did. Like he was kind of chauvinistic, like not very nice to his wife, but like it was kind of funny. And I was like, I don't know about this. Like I don't think this is very funny. But it was just like very, very cultural, and I wasn't like that immersed in Indian culture. And so I think it was like you can learn the language and learn the social language, but I feel like there'll be probably always some aspects of it if you weren't like born in it that you might not ever really understand.
Cultural thing too, like women are treated differently elsewhere.
Yeah.
So we could never get that humor. Like we would just be kind of offended. Like
That's something really to keep in mind too. Parent-teacher conferences.
Yeah.
I think we would try to break the ice a lot by making jokes, and if you have some students from or parents from other countries, they would just they might be offended.
Yeah. I made this really bad joke once at an English class when I was so like Ganesh, he has like 4 hands, and I was like trying to say, I was like, and he's like probably really good at multitasking. Like think of all the things he could be doing, and then like my helper person was like, and I was like, okay. And then I was
But see, like for us, that would be totally fine.
Catherine. Yeah, like oh yeah, you can. Oh, it was
Interesting.
awkward.
Your helper is like, no, don't go down that road.
Okay, our last couple points.
I think we've exhausted humor and other.
I think
We
we
talk about
have
our
everyone.
experiences learning.
Yes.
Oh,
Oh,
I
yeah,
also,
yeah.
that wasn't last week, that was this week. We talked about different languages. And then the ways that we learn language, like with audiobooks and.
Okay, that's why I was totally
Yeah,
blanking.
that's
I was
why you
like,
were confused.
why am I so lost?
Oh no, that was this
Makes
week.
sense.
It was, like,
Oh, yeah.
different ways
Oh,
that
yeah,
you're
let's talk
exposed
about
to
that. Okay.
language.
Okay, I remember reading yours.
My mom was really, like, loves foreign movies, and we'd watch a lot of foreign movies with subtitles. And I remember at first being like, why can't I just be like, why can't we just watch the movies that everyone else is watching? And then like friends would come over and be like, why are there subtitles? But I love foreign movies now, and like there is so much to learn from them. And I think it was just you can. It's a lot more complex to be able to read and to like watch the movie at the same time.
Yeah, I always watch movies with subtitles now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and shows. It's like the double of like hearing it and seeing it, so you're not missing anything.
Which is one of my favorite movies, was like The Butterfly or something. Have you seen that? It's in French.
Oh, cool.
And I loved it. And I
Is
just thought it was
that Dior?
hilarious. Yeah, I thought it was the greatest thing ever. And after that, I started watching things with subtitles. But in English, I still watch it without
Yeah.
There's a lot-
All my
there's a lot
friends
of
are
really
annoyed.
good French movies.
And it kind of confuses me when people do put subtitles on. What are you doing? I guess when I was reading as a kid, like I was a huge reader, and I would go and pick books. And before, like I picked a book that was kind of above my grade level, and like I hadn't covered some of the things in the book. And I read the whole thing thinking union was onion. I finally, after reading this whole like series, sat down with my mom and I was like, I'm confused. They talk a lot about onions, and I don't get it. And my mom like thought that was the funniest thing in the world.
It is funny.
And after it was explained, it made sense. But I could see that being so confusing to anybody else. That's how I learned about unions.
You probably won't forget that
I
now.
will never forget that.
It's interesting, Catherine, how you talk about watching movies as something that helped you develop language and
Yeah.
stuff, because I wasn't allowed to watch TV really, like some movies sometimes.
Yeah, I wasn't allowed to watch TV on school days at all.
Yeah,
I didn't have
and so I kind of always have thought of television as like somewhat the antithesis of like reading, you know, and developing like academic language, I guess, or professional language.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be that way at all, especially subtitles.
I think any type of language that you're also interested in. Like, it could also be magazines or newspapers or books or, like, whatever. But I guess it wasn't I didn't really watch a lot of TV growing up. It was mostly movies and, like, Friday nights or Saturdays.
Yeah,
So I didn't really watch any TV during the rest of the week. But I think I also put more in foreign movies because, like, language was even more apparent. I was like, A, they're speaking another language, and B, there's, like, something on, like, there's subtitles on the screen.
Probably really helps with you guys if, like, picking up on, like, physical gestures and voice intonation because you're reading it, but you're not hearing it in the language, so you're having to pick up on their visual cues.
Yeah. I don't know if you guys have ever watched a movie in a foreign language without subtitles and, like, tried seeing what's happening.
Yeah, no, I haven't. It's hard.
It's really, really, really interesting. And then, it's a really awesome, it's like a puzzle, but then it's also really, like, it makes you think so much. Like, there are so many English movies out there. Probably, then there's a lot of people who have languages who don't have any of the subtitles options. Like, they're not French,
Spanish, English.
Spanish, or, like, whatever. What if they speak Filipino or something?
Arabic.
Arabic.
Never seen an Arabic movie.
I haven't either.
One thing. What was I gonna say? Oh, two things. One, my mom's a teacher, so like, I don't know, I'm not really surprised she did this, but she like would read to us for a half an hour every night, like from a book, and we read like Peter and the Starcatchers. Just a good one.
Totally.
And,
Such a good one.
Yeah, like
So
all
good.
these different books, and so we'd lay in bed with her and like cuddle with her, and then she would read and like point her finger across it, so we would read with her.
See it.
But another thing I wanted to say, which is kind of interesting, is that I took this international studies course at UW, and it was the hardest class I've ever taken. It was the best class I've ever taken, I think, but like she would assign articles, and the words were so complex. Like every single word was such a high level word that it took me like days to go through, like hours to like go through and like,
look up the words.
and it was really imperative that I understood it because everybody else in my class would be talking about it and I couldn't understand it. So it made me think of like ELL students, immersion bilinguals, trying to like read an academic text that didn't have to be like at that extreme like PhD level, but even just like at a 6th grade level if they're in maybe they're in 6th grade and it's just too
Analyze
advanced.
the hypothesis.
Yeah,
Exactly.
an
And
example.
use these quantities to find a sum. It's like
Yeah, if you didn't understand, that's pretty much what it was. That sentence would make absolutely no sense to you.
yeah.
So I guess like you'd really just have to know where their level is at and build upon it because that would be really difficult.
Yeah.
Something that our math teacher Janet has mentioned when she's like even just teaching us vocab words is that she always, when she can, she tries to always teach the roots for the words, like the etymology. And for some languages that are like Latin based, right? That could be a really helpful way to learn kind of the more complex academic language.
I talked about how I like the section above the language and ELLs. I like the presentation on academic language. I talked about how one reason I thought probably math was really hard for me growing up was that teachers didn't present the vocabulary like they were vocabulary. Like it was done in English. Like in English, you have like vocabulary tests. You understand the words, then you like are able to understand those concepts and then use it for the text that you're reading. While in math, it's just kind of like, oh, this is what we're using, and at least that's how it was taught.
And and they'll say like this means this, but then they expect you to apply it right away.
Yeah.
I guess being really explicit would be the
Being explicit
And
is
like hands-on like models of like.
Yeah. That was my belly.
We exhausted.
I think I've talked about everything I've covered. If anyone else wants to cover anything else, they can.
one more thing I want to say is that I think it depends a lot on your background, not only just like culturally, but like I don't know. Some parents don't like read like science journals or don't watch documentaries, and then your child, like the child would be not as set up.
And
Depending on the level.
I think that's such a good point. Like seeing someone monitoring or their own language and how they want to keep improving it. Like as a teacher, you need to show that to your students and be like, "This is a book that I like. I've just finished a book," or just modeling that you're continuing to and that you're still learning. And like my mom and dad both have done that too for like professional development. They've like listened to things that relate to their careers in the car, or they'll like be reading journals, or they have to go through testing like every couple of years to like keep being certified or whatever. But if your parent or if you have no one in your life that's doing that, like you don't have any models of someone who's going to pursue language, and so then you don't really know how that works either.
Yeah, like for instance, if your dad was a welder who would have tons of knowledge on welding, and you'd have all these different vocabulary words and terms for that, but maybe doesn't read scientific journals or like a magazine, and like so then that would be the part that you would lacking, but then you would have strengths in other areas.
And I feel like fortunate in that area is that like both my parents are like very intellectually focused, but like there's other things that they're not focused in. Like it'd be really cool to know about welding.
My parents didn't so much read the like scientific journals or anything, but I remember if I was like ever interested in discussing just books that I had read, like I read The Life of Pi,
Mhm.
And I immediately was like, I want to talk about this with someone. Like, there are things that confuse me. I really want to talk about this with someone. And so my dad sat down and read it so that he could sit and discuss it with me. So anything like that, they were really good with that aspect. Like, they sit down and read anything I wanted them to, just so I could discuss it further with them.
That's so
So
cool.
maybe
awesome.
not like
You win an award.
journals, but like
Yeah,
No, it
that's
doesn't
cute.
That's
fiction,
awesome.
literature. Just
That's
yeah,
so
I thought it
cool.
was great, and like my dad still does that now.
That like investment in you.
He's
Yeah,
reread
totally.
so many books because of me.
That's
Well,
so
you're
cool.
really, that shows you that you're really valued and you have a better
It did
self-esteem
make me
because
feel
of
a lot
that,
better about
probably.
myself. I was like, wow, I'll
Yeah.
sit down and do this for me.
Yeah, and so the kids that don't have that, like, you as a teacher need to step in.
Yeah, step in and like
Yeah.
do that for them. If
But-
they want to discuss something like that, your kid like if it's an easy read or like if it's just something that you can look into,
Mhm.
Yeah.
just to do that small thing for the child
Yeah.
to kind of justify their thinking and questions or whatever.
I remember like a teacher, like my 3rd, 4th grade teacher, I'd be reading a book and she'd be like, "Oh, I love this book. Like, wait till you get to the end. Like, it's this me. Like, just keep reading it." Or they'll be like,
say that about so many books.
or she'd like say something specific,
Oh, okay.
like, "Oh, like whole." She's like, "Pay attention to like the details of like different things." Like, "Oh, okay." Or you know, she
And then you feel like she cares, and you could like
Yeah.
go to her and be like, "I got to this
My
part, and it was so
librarian
exciting."
was the best. Now I'm really upset because library has totally changed now with technology.
Yeah.
We used to just sit on. We had these huge like foam things, and everybody would just sit on them, and she would read aloud to us.
Yeah,
And we
that's
do
what-
origami afterwards, and it was awesome. And like now we don't do that anymore, which is a bummer. But my teacher would be like, "You love that book. Here's another book that I know you'll love too."
I loved
She
that.
was librarians are the best.
Yeah, they are. I think maybe I should be a librarian.
That would be. I mean, it's awesome, and
I
like
wanted to when I was in like elementary school. Seeing my teacher do this, I was like, that's what
I
I
never
want to
got along
do.
that well with librarians.
My librarian-
So it's too
And
loud.
when she
for
retired,
functions
I
in the
was-
library.
I was too loud, and they also said like I would want to read books that were either like way too high or way too low.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
not like my yellow dot or whatever it was, and I'd be like, I want to be constrained to my yellow dot. She'd be like, you can't read that. That's like
You
too
won't
hard
understand.
well, then maybe she.
And then they try and
Wasn't
teach
being
you the Dewey Decimal System.
Oh, that was a confusing time for me. That's what I loved. It was like, oh, librarian, you. No, you've added
Oh,
numbers
yeah.
to the
Yeah, I
equation.
remember that
I
too.
don't like this.
I was like, just stick to colors.
But so the exposure to books
Thanks for
and
bringing it in.
language material and people who care.
Yeah, I think people who care is really massive, and for ELLs, like if a student has a family that is like if their parents are migrant workers, like they're not gonna have a lot of time to be like they're moving from place to place. Their job involves like if it's really physically laborious.
Yeah.
And like they're not gonna be able to have a lot of time to just sit and read with them,
No.
even if they want to. They want to probably.
Yeah.
So that's something to really think about.
For sure.
Indeed, good talk.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Good talk.
Good night.